Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. So today we'll be having a look at the form element. This is kind of the foundation for any sort of interactivity in any web app, and regardless of what framework you're going to be using, there's probably going to be a form element in there somewhere, and we're going to be having a look at it in kind of plain HTML so you understand the fundamentals, and then it's easy to kind of learn how frameworks use it. For the most part, we're going to look at the kind of the original web way of working with forms, and then kind of towards the end we'll have a quick look at how they're traditionally used in single page applications, just kind of as a placeholder. But yeah, let's get right into it. If you enjoyed this kind of content, please consider subscribing, and yeah, let's go. So I've got an index HTML file here, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open that up in the browser, and we're going to start off with, of course, the form, right? So the form element here, it's not going to display anything on the page. It's kind of a wrapper element for inputs and other elements. So we're going to start off with the form, and we're just going to add an input here. And this is basically the absolute minimum you need to have some sort of working form, almost fully working. So you can see on the right hand side here, we have this is an input, this is a text input. So we have types on the input. We're going to have a look at those later on. It defaults to text, so we can add text to our input. And in fact, we can also submit our form. There's no submit button, but by default, when you have a form, you can just hit enter and you can submit the form. So if I hit enter here, you're going to see it's kind of a bit of a refresh. The input's cleared, and you may have noticed that the URL's changed ever so slightly. We'll look at that later on. So I've got kind of a working form, but this isn't really the minimum, for people to use, right? So let's add a few things to kind of get it up to scratch. So the first thing we're going to add is a button, right? You usually want to submit, by pressing a button. So we're going to add another input, and we can do type equals, and there's a couple of things we can do. So the first and the main one is this submit type. So this is basically this is going to add a button of type submit, and this is basically a way to add a submit button. So when I add text here and I can hit submit, it's going to submit the form. Again, we'll look at what submitting does later on, and that's just the equivalent of hitting enter, right? You may also see button here. Type of button is just, it's an empty button, but it doesn't actually submit the form. It's just literally just a button with no functionality. And then the final button is a reset button here. So if I do reset, type in text, it's going to do exactly that. It's going to clear the form. Most of the time, you don't want to use input for this at all. There's kind of like an alias, which is called button here. And this button is basically exactly the same as doing input with type submit. But this is going to default to submit. And let's just type in submit here. So this one, you actually add the text. If you look at the types here, you can see button, submit, reset. That's kind of the three things there. So they do the exact same thing. Button's just a bit more, I guess, explicit, so it's more widely used. So we now have a button here. Let me just remove this. There we go. So we now have a button. I can submit it, but you can see here, if I expand this out, when I'm hitting submit, we can see this change in URL, there's a question mark. What's meant to happen here is when I hit submit by default, it's basically meant to add all the elements in my form. But why is it not adding anything now? Well, it doesn't know how to. It doesn't know what inputs we're adding. If we add multiple inputs here, it doesn't know how to differentiate between them, so it doesn't know what to name them. So basically, we need to give them a name, right? Very important, always give your inputs a name. So I'm going to give this one a name of title, right? So I'm going to start off with an input of title. And straight away, if I type in test and I hit enter, you're going to see it's going to add title equals text. Again, there's probably one last thing we want to add, even though it's working, there's one last thing we want to add for accessibility, for kind of usability, is we want to add a label, right? The user doesn't really know what this is for. So let's add a quick label. So that's just with the label component. And we're going to give a label, we're going to give it a name of title. But that in itself, although it's got the title there, so visually it looks, like it's working, it's not actually linked to the input. There's no link. So usually when you click on the title, it kind of interacts with the input itself. And if it's linked, it also means, accessibility-wise, screen readers can link the title, this label, to the input, which it doesn't have now. A couple of ways of doing that. You could, for example, add an ID to the input, call this one title. You can go up to the label and say, hey, this label is for the title. So now that kind of works. I click on that and it's all linked. The way I like to do it is just by nesting the input inside the label itself. So let's basically swap these two around. So now we can click on either or, and that's going to work absolutely fine. All right, so now that we've got form, let's do a little bit of a quiz. What do you think would happen if I take this submit button and put it outside of the form? So just take a second, ignoring the kind of the styling changes, what do you think would happen if I put in some text and hit submit? So think about that for a second and then, pause and play the video. All right, so if I hit submit here and you said nothing happens, then you're right. So nothing happens because this button is no longer kind of part of this form, right? So that kind of makes sense. And I guess the next part of the quiz, what do you think would happen if I move the input, right? Again, ignoring the styling. So I have a form here with no input. If I type something in here and I hit submit, what do you think is going to happen? Again, pause, play the video. If you guessed, again, it's going to submit the form, but it's not going to submit it with any data, with the titles just not part of the form anymore, then you're right. Cool. So, 2 out of 2 if you got them 2 right. So I guess the question now is, if I take this form or this button out, this is kind of the third question of the quiz. Do you think you can get this working with the form, even though it's outside? We saw it didn't work earlier on. It didn't work. You can't submit it. Can you get this to submit the form without without JavaScript, basically? I know you can always do stuff with JavaScript, but with straight up HTML, can you get this to submit the form? Answer again, yes, you can. And the way you do that is by giving the form an ID. So let's call this some form. And then what you can do is you can just go onto the button and you can say, hey, this form or this button belongs to the form, some form. And what that does is basically that links them. So that almost kind of puts the form inside, puts the button inside the form. So now I can go to the title, I can type in some text and I hit submit and it's submitted fine. It's as if the button was inside the form. I'm sure you guessed, but the same question goes for the input. Can I get this to work? So it's an empty form, but can I get the input and the button to work? Yes, I can, using the form prop. So I can chuck this form into this input. Here we go, and I can hit refresh here. So now it just looks like the original, but you can see there's nothing in the form. However, when I submit here and I press enter, it's going to submit it. And if I expand this a bit, and what I'll do is I'll just leave that expanded a bit, you can see the title with the value there. So this is actually really useful, especially for single page apps where you've got different components, or just sort of any kind of framework when you've got different components sitting at different levels, and you might not want to wrap everything in a form, or you might have your input, somewhere here in the kind of the hierarchy or the tree, and you've got your form here, and you don't know how to link them. This is basically how you can do that in a nice and quick way. But for us, we're just going to put everything back in here. Let's pop these back and let's just remove these forms. And there we go. Cool. Okay, so next up, let's have a look at what happens when you actually submit the form. Then we'll have a look at all the different types of inputs. So when you submit a form, if I open up the network tab here, and you can just do that by right-click and inspect an element on kind of Chrome or Brave. And if you just go to the network tab here, so when you refresh the page, when you just come into the page, it's going to do a request to, in this case, the index.html. It's just a get request, and it's just going to return the code, right? If I hit submit here, hello, it's going to do the exact same thing. So we can see in index.html, we can see it submitted the form. All it's done is as if you've taken this URL here, so we can see the URL. Let me expand that. It's taken the original URL. It adds the data of the form as query parameters, as search parameters. And then it's just as if I've gone into the URL, hit there, and hit enter. That's basically the effect that it's doing, right? So I submit it, enter it. It just makes a get request to the URL. And there we go. So in here, this is a kind of the default behavior, right? And where is that? You might ask, well, it's all happening inside the form. So if I go into the form and I do method, we're going to see get and post. So the default one's get, and that's where you see the request method. And then if you do action, you can basically see the URL. So it's the default is basically the existing URL index.html. And typically what you might have is submitted HTML. So yeah, let's go ahead and create this. So if I hit enter here, create the file, submitted. Let me take this down and put this as a h1. And actually, I'm just going to copy over some code here. So I'm just going to copy over a little script just under the body. I'm just going to add a pre-tag here. And this is just going to show us what we've submitted. So all this does here is it gets the window location, basically gets the URL. It finds the search parameters from the URL. And then it's just going to get the pre-tag here, and it's just going to append basically the stringified version of the parameters. So let's go back to our index.html. So we've now changed the action to submitted.html. So now when I do hello and I hit submit, it's going to do a get request, but this time instead of, let me refresh this. Hello, let's try it again. Hello, so enter. Instead of going back to the index.html, now it's going to the submitted HTML. it's called the submitted. It's passed the parameters, and obviously in the submitted HTML, we're looking at the parameters and we're just printing them onto the screen as a JSON object. So that's basically how that flow typically works, right? Another thing, kind of the final thing here, is you don't need to, doesn't need to be a kind of an internal HTML file. We can go to, you know, let's do google.com/search, and I think I need to prefix this with HTTPS. And if I change this to Q, which is what Google uses for its searches, and I go back, let's go back to the search here. Now, if I do MDN form and I hit enter, oops, well, you can see the kind of the terms and agreements there, but it's basically submitted the Q equals MDN form, and you can see this is all kind of URL safe. It's basically encoded, so it's all kind of working fine. So you've just built yourself a small Google, and well done. Yeah, let's undo that and let's have a look at the post now. So we'll go back here. Post, if we open up the network tab again and I do hello and I hit enter, it's going to go to the submitted HTML again. But the difference here, and actually what I'll do is I'll go back and I'm just going to do it without this path parameter. So I'm going to do hello, and you can see that there's nothing here. It's not submitted the rest of the search parameters. It's not added the search parameters of the form, but they are there somewhere. And if I jump into the network request here, we can see we're obviously doing the post now. But if you look at the request headers, you can see that the request header now is, here we go, it's form URL encoded, right? So it's now submitting a form instead of just adding onto the search params. And if I look at the payload, we can see the title hello. So this is usually used for actually submitting data, you know, saving things to the database, whatever it is. This is going to go over to the server, and then the server can receive and you do whatever it wants with the title, and then it can redirect you or return whatever it needs to return. In this case, again, I'm running this all on IntelliJ, so I don't have control over the server, but usually if you do, this is basically where the data would go. So that's post, that's get. Yeah, let's have a look at the different types of inputs now. So I'm back onto just the standard form tutorial. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add one thing here, autocomplete equals off. This is just useful. So when you've got a form, usually it's going to try autocomplete with all the previous things you've searched, emails, etc. I'm just going to turn that off so it doesn't keep showing all my emails, etc. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste a bunch of labels, right? There's not really much going on here. I've just copied and pasted a bunch of, I'd say that the most commonly used labels. I think there's probably a few more, but I think these cover the majority of the scenarios. I'm going to save this, and I'm just going to copy a tiny bit of styling as well. So I'm just going to chuck style tag here, just so it's a bit better to look at. I'm going to close this. So all I've done here is I've added a bunch of labels, inputs, and the name here, I'm just going to change this to lowercase. The name here is going to correspond to the type. So if you see checkbox here, that means the type is checkbox, radio, the type is radio, so on and so forth. And here, I'm not going to go into too much detail for every single one of these because you can basically see this. It's quite self-explanatory. The few ones I will caveat are the ones that kind of behave a bit differently. So we have, again, the text, checkbox is standard. The radio button here, the name is basically what groups them. So if I want a radio button and I want you to pick between these three, I will give them all the same name. And then the value, the radio equals, the value that will kind of be added needs to be added into the HTML cell. So the value is either going to be S, M, or L, depending on which group. So if I wanted another group, I'll just create another, 3 or 4, however many radio buttons, and just give them all a different name, right? We have number, we have color pickers, date things. What else? We have the email, type in something. We can obviously open up a file. Hidden, so hidden one's an interesting one. So hidden input is just usually added for metadata. So this has got a value, you can't see me. So you can't see that on the HTML here, but you will see it later on when we submit the file. It's worth knowing, don't store any kind of secrets and stuff in here. You can still see it if you inspect the element. It's not meant for kind of secrets, it's just meant for basically metadata in your form, because this will still be sent to the server or still attached to the URL. We have password, ranges, URL, text area, and then we have some drop downs. So the drop downs are a bit, again, different. It's a standard label. You can see here there's a select with a bunch of options, and then the name goes on the select here. And then you have a data list, which is basically just an input. You can do whatever you want, but it gives you some suggestions. So you can still kind of, if I start typing, it gives you suggestions, but really I can ignore that, right? So yeah, let's submit this, and you can see there's kind of already with the different types, there's already a bit of validation going on. So this is nothing we're just going to get into, a bit of validation into the form. So because this is an email, it's expecting you to put in something that looks like an email, right? So you can see it, hit enter there, says, hey, include an at and etc. So I include an at, and then I try enter. It's like, hey, actually, it should be something like this. So let's type in something at something dot something. So that works. And then I think the URL is also going to complain. So it's expecting a URL. So let's just do http google.com. Now, if I hit enter, I don't want to save that. It's going to go submitted, and here's all the values. You can see the email, you can see the color there, and everything else. And also worth noting here, again, you can see the hidden field. You can't see me, I can see you now, right? Don't worry about it. Cool. So I'll leave a link to the kind of the MDN website where you can see all the different types. So there may be a kind of a few more to play around with, but I think that's the majority of them. What we'll have a look at now is basically some of the properties on an input, right? So we saw already the email had kind of its own validation. Well, we can do that with an input of type text without kind of the email. The way that we do that is basically adding a pattern, right? So you add a pattern and then you add a regular expression. So in this case, let's just do so good or bad. So this is my regular expression, which means if I now type in something here and I hit submit, it's going to say, hey, that's not matching the kind of the format requested, right? The error messages, I'm going to say, are not great here. This is why usually there's plenty of other solutions, but at least it's there. The other ones most commonly used, you have things like required, which means you basically need to submit it. So if I try to submit this form, it's going to say, hey, please fill in this field. You can have disabled, which is just going to keep it disabled. You can do things like min length 2, max length of 10. You also have min and max, which are numbers. So the min and max will only work, I think, pretty much on the number input here. Let me think. And you can also do hidden if you don't want to show it at all. So again, this is the same as basically doing a type of hidden. And I think that's pretty much most of the basic ones. There's a lot more kind of advanced things you could do with inputs, but most of the time you want to stay away from those and just kind of keep it relatively simple. And just a note on the validation, even though we've got a bit of validation here, you always want to additionally validate on the server because there's always ways to basically bypass these. But for the most part, these are going to be fine. Cool, so I think that's pretty much everything about forms. So now you're a form expert. So the final thing we're going to look at is basically how they're generally used with single page applications. So with single page applications, you don't want to, or you don't really have a server most of the time to kind of submit and come back. So what you do is you can use, usually like things like React will use the form as kind of like a placeholder. And then what they might do is they might kind of do, you might see this on submit, and then the on submit function inside here, so that you can override the behavior of submitting a form, right? So that's what we're going to do here, and we're just going to do this in plain JavaScript. So I'm just going to jump over here. I'm going to add a script, and another tip for you here is if I do document.forms, if I just open up the console here and I do document.forms, that basically is a re-export of all the forms in the application or in the page. So it basically lists them as a list, so you can get them by index. In this case, I can just say hey 0, or if you've got a form ID, or even I think a form name as well. So let's ID or name. So let's do name and then do some form again here. Now, if I go down to the bottom and I do dot named item, and I can do some form. There we go. So if I copy that in here, that's just basically, let me just refresh this page. That's going to bring back the form, and now you can do whatever you want with that form, right? So what I'm going to do here, again, I'm going to copy a bit of JavaScript. So what we're going to do is we're going to override the onSubmit with a function. So this takes in a function that just looks like this. This is just an arrow function, and it passes in the event. This is the event from submitting the form itself. So what I'll do is I'll just copy over that function. I'm just going to do this right here. And all this is doing is, the very first line is doing is event.prevent_default. And this is why generally, a lot of the new frameworks nowadays with server-side rendering are trying to avoid this kind of thing, because you're preventing the default behavior of the web. So when you add this, it kind of just turns the form into just kind of like a placeholder. So if I try to submit the form, it's not going to do the default behavior of sending to the server, which is what you want in a single page application. And then you saw down here, you can still get all the form data very easily, right? You just go new form data and you pass in the form itself, which is this event.target. And then all I'm doing is I'm wrapping it around in object.from entries, just so it turns it into a nice JSON object. And then just like before, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add inside the body, I'm going to add a pre-tag. So all I'm doing is query selector, pre-tag, and then I'm just going to set the inner HTML to a JSON version, the JSON string of object.entries from the form. So if I refresh this guy, do tests, fill out some of these. Let's just fill out this text area, fill this out. And if I hit submit now, what you're going to see is the JSON representative of the form. And that's basically, in here is where you would, go fetch your data, fetch something with, with your form data directly. And this is basically how the SPAs work. And yeah, I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to cover in this video. So yeah, I think I'll wrap up there. Thank you very much for watching. Have a good day, and I will see you in the next one.